This is my next video in my Devnet Associate Certification series of videos. Working towards a Cisco Devnet Associate certification, you have to have a background in Python. You need to know a little Python and a little Linux, the bash shell. And so to start this series, I'm going with a crash course in Python to just cover the Python basics and start with that. For that, I'm using the book Python Crash Course by Eric Mathis, and I'll scroll up to it right here. So this is what it looks like. It's the second edition, and it's an excellent book for beginners wanting to learn Python. So we're on chapter 11 in the book, which is called Testing Your Code. And Testing Your Code introduces the unit test library, or the unit test module, which allows you to test your functions to see if they're basically handling the input and producing the results that you're expecting. So it's basically a testing framework, and it's built right into Python. So in the chapter, Eric Mathis covers it step by step, and you have to work through each of the files. Now I've changed the name of the files here a little bit so that they were easier for me. So instead of like name.py or formatted name.py, I've just got chapter 11_1. Let's take a look at it. In this Python script, you create a function called getFormattedName, and then you're going to pass it two parameters, the first name and last name, and then you're going to take this full name variable and make it equal to an F string, a formatted string of the first and last name, and then you return that full name variable, and you also run the title method on it, which will capitalize the first letters in each name. Now, it's just a function, right? So it's a Python script. It's got this function, getFormattedName, where we pass a first and a last name. So let's test it out. But to test it out, we'll just say, hey, this variable, the name, equals call getFormattedName, pass it John Doe, and then print the result. And if it works, then we know it works. So we do this, and we run the program. We run the script. Okay, and you can see it returns John Doe with a capital J and a capital D. So we know that this file works, right? This function is working. It's returning what we wanted it to. It returns the full name titleized. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll comment this out again and comment that out, and I'll save it. Control X, Y, and enter. Now in the book, he creates a file that has a function, and then he creates another file. And the next file is, I've named it chapter 11_2 to keep track of it. And in this file, you can see that it imports the function getFormattedName from the chapter 11_1.py file. And then it has a little script, and it's going to use this function that it imported. So basically, you can enter Q at any time to quit, a while loop, so while true, so this will loop indefinitely, or to loop forever. And you basically say first, the first variable, and asks for user input to give a first name. If you put a Q, it'll break out of the loop. Then the last variable also asks for user input for the last name. And if you give a Q, it will also end the loop and end the script. Then the variable formatted name equals, and then finally it calls the getFormattedName and passes in the first parameter and the last parameter which the user supplied. And then it will print it out here. So let's test it out. So it looks pretty basic, but let's test it out. Okay, so we'll run it and test out his code. Okay, enter Q at any time to quit. First name, so Mike, and last name Trout, and neatly formatted name Mike Trout, capital M, capital T, and you can see it just keeps looping, so it's asking again for a first name. So I'll put in a Q and hit enter, and it should quit, and it did. So we have the program that calls the function. Okay, now we actually finally get to start with a unit test to test code. So that happens in the next file. So the next file is chapter 11_3.py. And in this file, the first thing that happens is you import the unit test module or library, and you don't need to install it because it's one of the standard libraries within Python. So, and then we import the get formatted name function from the chapter 11_1 file, and then here is our test code right here. So you create a class, and the class name is called names test case, right? Because that's basically what we're doing here. Notice the capital N here, it's a class, and it inherits the unit test library, the unit test module, specifically the test case method. So it's inheriting unit test.test case. Then in your unit test, what you do is you create tests as functions. So, and what you want to do is in unit test, if the function starts with test underscore, then it'll automatically be executed when you run your test case. So if you create your functions, you want to name them test underscore something, and then they'll automatically be part of the test. So it's just built into unit test, that functionality. So here is the function test underscore first underscore last name. Notice it's required that you pass it the self parameter here because it's a class. And then formatted underscore name calls our function, and we pass it basically the information that we want to test. So we're testing, like, if I pass this function Mike Trout lowercase, then self, so this can be used, it basically refers to this class and can be accessed from anywhere within this class, self.assert equal. And we can use different types of assert calls in the unit test. We can assert equal, assert not equal, assert in, assert not in, assert true, assert false. And so here we assert equal is formatted name, which is our variable. Is it equal to what we're expecting, which should be Mike Trout, capital M, capital T. And so this is basically, it's a testing if this is equal to this. Then to run this class or to call this class, basically what we do is we say if the name of this file when it's run equals underscore underscore main underscore underscore. So when you run a file like this, if you run this Python script, the variable name will get associated with main if it's the main file that's being launched. And if it is, which it is, in other words, you can't import this file from some other script, it will call the unit test main function, which will then call, basically, it'll execute these test functions. Okay, it'll execute the test functions. So let's give it a try. So we'll say Control X and we'll run it. And you can see that it runs the test. Now the dot indicates a successful test, and it says ran one test in 0.00 seconds and it went okay. Now if you have large program with many functions, then you would use something like this to automate testing your functions in different ways. And that's essentially what he does next. He basically says, what if, now that you've seen this test work and in successful test, what does a failed test look like? So for the failed test, what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to open up another file here, chapter 11_1b. Okay, whoops, I don't want to run it, I want to open it and check it out. So here's chapter 11_1b, and this time the function's been changed. Get formatted name now requires a first, middle, and last parameter. And if there's a middle parameter, if middle, then the full name equals first, middle, and last. Else, full name is just first and last. And then return the full name variable and titleize it with the title method. So basically, this function is now expecting 3 parameters. Now, this is going to cause errors because if you only pass it 2 parameters, this middle initial is now required. the way this is written, if it doesn't have 3 parameters passed to it, it should error out. And we'll see what I mean here. So now we'll do a Control X, and we'll open up the next file, which is chapter 11 underscore 4. And whoops, no, that's not what I wanted. We'll open up the next file, which is chapter 11 underscore 3b. There we go. 3b. So in this, basically everything is the same so far here, except now we have 2 tests. We're going to define here a function, test first last name. So formatted name, the variable formatted name equals, and it calls our get formatted name and passes 2 parameters. Now this should fail because it's expecting a first, a middle, and a last. Basically, we're just giving it a first and middle, thinking that this is a first and last and that it should work. And then we're saying, does formatted name end up equaling Mike Trout? In other words, if we pass it these parameters, if we give it these inputs, will the result, equal this? Well, it's going to error out, so the result won't equal this. It's going to be an error. Then we're testing first, last, middle name. So here in this test, we're saying formatted name, get formatted name, Wolfgang Mozart Amadeus. And let's see here, let's change it to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. There we go. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Okay, so we'll see, does this equal this? So we'll call this and see what happens. So everything else is the same. It's got 2 tests. One is testing 2 names. The other one's testing 3 names with the first, middle, and last. So Control X, Y, and enter, and then we'll run it, and we'll see what kind of result we get. So you can see here that we get an error, and we can see here that the dot, so one test was good, looks like one test was good, and then there was an error. Okay, error, test first last name. So this is the function where the error happened, and then it tells us exactly kind of where it happened. So line 9, formatted name, get formatted name, Mike Trout. Type error, get formatted name missing one required positional argument or parameter, right? It's missing the last. So in other words, we gave it the first, and then we gave it what was the middle, and then it's expecting the last, and it wants 3 parameters. It wants 3 arguments, and we only gave it 2. So, ran 2 tests with 1 error. And that makes sense because if we look at our test that we created, right, we knew that it's not going to work with just two arguments or 2 parameters when it's expecting 3. This one did work. Okay, so let's go and change the file so that it no longer errors out. So we'll go in and we'll change 1b, and we'll say first, we'll say last, and then middle, we'll make it equal to an empty string, so it's optional. So now first, last, and middle has a default value of an empty string, so this will be optional because it has a default value. So it won't error out if you just pass it 2 items. So Control X, Y, and enter. And this is all in the book, chapter 11. It's pretty cool. It's a great chapter, great introduction into the unit test. So now we'll have to change this one slightly though. And we'll say Wolfgang Mozart, last name, and then Amadeus. Because it's expecting it in this format. There we go. Okay, now both of these tests, if our function is able to handle 2 inputs or 2 arguments or 3 arguments. We're testing the function 2 different ways. And, and that's the point, is that you can test your code in different ways for all the different types of input that you would be expecting. So, and let's see here, Control X, Y, and enter, and then we'll run it. And you can see, ... it ran both tests, 2 tests, and they were both okay. So everything was good. So that worked out nicely. So the rest of the chapter goes on the same way, except it just keeps making it just a little more advanced scenarios, but essentially it's the same stuff. So in other words, if you look at the chapter 11_4, if we open that one up, I'll show you really quickly. You see here a class called Anonymous Survey, where you basically have an initialization function. This is called by automatically called. Notice self, and it's posed a question, and then self.question equals whatever the question is that you've passed to it when the class is instantiated. And then also you have a responses list. So you have a question and you have a responses list. And then you can show the question that was passed. You can store a response, self.responses append a new response. So this method requires a response, and then it gets stored in responses. And then you can show the results, where you loop through your responses list and show the different responses. So it's a little survey class, and notice the capital A, it's class. And so then Control X, then we'll see how that gets played out. So how would that get used in a program, in a script? We import the anonymous survey. We define a question. The question equals what language did you first learn to speak? Then we create a mySurvey object. In other words, we instantiate the class anonymous survey, passing in the question which we've created here. Then we can mySurvey show the question. You can see here shows the question. Then enter Q at any time to quit. We give the option there, print out, hey, you can enter Q. And then another while loop where we get our response from user input, and then we use the store response method to store that response. At the end, we can show the results and print out thank you, and you can see that it works. So we could test this out. Let's just test it out really quickly, just to show you that it works. Okay, what language did you first learn to speak? And then I say English. Okay, and or English, or I can Spanish. There we go. So, and then Q to quit, and you can see here, thank you for participating, and the results, there was English, capital English, Spanish. So it's basically worked as expected. So how do you test it now? So the test looks like this, stored in chapter 11_6.py. We'll open it up. And the test looks like this. You've got 2 test functions, test underscore. In other words, these functions start with test and underscore, so they'll be automatically called when the unit test is run, when the test case is run. And so you can see here, this is testing a single response, and this is testing 3 responses. And you can see here the responses are listed here in a list, and then you loop through the responses and you store the responses, and then you loop through them again, and then you run an assert in. And notice here that the test self assert in the previous test that we wrote, it was assert equal. So does the variable equal this response? In this case, it's assert in. Is English in the responses list? And in this case, looping through each response, all three responses in the list. And so that's what it's testing basically. And we'll run it really quickly here. This is 6, and you'll see that it works. Whoops, Python 3, sorry. And you can see that it ran both tests and it works. Now a variation on this is 6b. So in a more streamlined version of that test, you've got here a setup function that's called first. And in a unit test, if you use a setup function, of course it's past self, this will get executed before the test functions. So you can use this setup function to create variables or properties that you could access in your tests so that you're not repeating yourself. So in this case, the setup function says, here's the question, which we can use in the other tests. And then it says my survey, so it creates a my survey object out of the anonymous survey class and pass in the question. So now we have my survey. So now we could use my survey in this test, and you can see that it uses my survey in these tests as well. So then we have self.responses, which is a list of, let's say, 3 languages. So then here's the single response, which calls my survey, and then asserts is response item 0 in the responses. And then here, once again, we loop through the responses and assert if they are in the list of responses. So it's basically testing whether or not the anonymous survey is handling a single response or handling multiple responses. And then you could test it in different ways to see if it keeps working. Anyway, that's it. So that's the main gist of Chapter 11, giving you basically an introduction into the unit test library and how it can be used for testing your code.